We're going to start with Chapter 18 now. Stress, Coping, Adjustment, and Health. So we are going to leave the social and cultural domain, and we're going to enter into what's called the adjustment domain. And as your PowerPoint says, this is the domain in which personality plays a key role in how we cope, adapt, and adjust to the events in our daily lives. So what's going to happen is, in this domain, we're going to explore some of the consequences of personality. We're going to look at physical health and mental health and how we attempt to adjust to our daily lives. And we're going to start by looking at physical adjustment and health and exploring some questions like, are people more inclined to become ill? What's the effect of stress? Do some people handle stress differently? So we're going to look at that. And by the way, the information we're going to discuss in this chapter has given rise to an interesting subfield in psychology, if you're interested in it, called health psychology. All right, let's look at stress, because a significant amount of research has been done exploring the role of personality and stress. Stress is defined, right on your PowerPoint, a negative emotional experience to a threatening event that's accompanied by predictable physiological, cognitive, and behavioral changes. What causes stress are these stressors, events that cause stress, stressors. And stress is the consequence of a person's appraisal process in response to situations. And there are two appraisals, so we're going to talk about this. So here's what this whole PowerPoint means. There are things that happen to us, these experiences. Now, if we perceive them to be threatening and we make these two appraisals, we're going to feel stress. We're going to talk about what these two appraisals are. There are primary and secondary appraisal. So something happens to us, and the first thing we do is we make this thing called a primary appraisal. The primary appraisal is really about how threatening is this event to us. Is this event really a threat, or is it just a challenge and not really a threat at all? That's what that's our primary appraisal. That's the first thing we do when we're faced with a certain situation. I gave an example. So if the event in your life is I've lost my job, and you say, but I'll find another, you're looking at that event as just a challenge. You're not really seeing it as a strong threat in your world. Or you could say, I've lost my job and this is not good. I don't have money saved. I don't know what I'm going to do. This isn't good. I'm really scared. Then that becomes a threat. So you can look at an event in either way. That's your primary appraisal. Now, if you say it's not a threat, it's a challenge, you're done. It doesn't stress you. But if you determine that it is a threat, you're going to make a secondary appraisal. And the secondary appraisal is really just about whether we have the personal resources to sufficiently meet the demands of the event. So yes, this event is happening. Yes, we've already perceived it to be a threat. And now we ask the question, do we have the resources to meet the demands of this event? So here's some examples. So I've lost my job and we've already determined that it's a threat. So then you say, I think I have some money in savings. I think I can get another job within the next month. I could pay my rent for the next month. I already have. My sister owes me $200. Everything's going to be okay. So you've already determined, yes, it's a threat that you've lost your job, but you do have the resources to deal with this event. Or it can be an example of, I've lost my job, it's a threat, and I don't have any money in savings, no job ideas. I'm in big trouble. I've got nothing. I don't know what I'm going to do. So yes, it's a threat. And then your secondary appraisal about resources, you come up with, I don't have the resources to deal with this. Therefore, it becomes a stress. Because, right here on the bottom, if your primary appraisal is that the event is a threat, and your secondary appraisal is that you do not have the resources, that's what causes us to be stressed. So at either point, either in our primary or secondary appraisal, we could face this event differently and it never becomes a stress, which is why a lot of people, you might know people in your life that you go, man, they never get stressed. Like water, it just rolls off them like water off a duck's back. They're making either a different primary or a different secondary appraisal to events that occur in their lives. But for all of us, if you make the first primary appraisal of it is a threat, and your secondary appraisal when you're looking at resources is that I don't have the resources, then that event becomes a stress. All right, so now that's what becomes a stress. What happens to us? When we do assess something to be a stressor, it's interesting. This chain of events happens, and it's a pretty predictable chain of events. Our blood pressure increases, heart rate increases. Neurons that are really important, we'd like to keep those little buggers around for as long as we can at least. We see an over-destruction, a significant increase in destruction of neurons, more so than normal. Increased sweating, even if you don't notice it. Sometimes you'll say, man, I'm just sweating all over the place. But sometimes, even if you don't notice an increase in sweating, there'll be an increase in sweating with stress. Our blood vessels constrict, which means they get smaller. Now, you got to think about what's going on now. Our blood pressure is higher, our heart rate's higher, but now our blood vessels are smaller. They've constricted. We see changes in chemical production in the body, and I just generalized it to this way because there are a lot of things that happen, and I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about some of them, but our body doesn't work the same. Our liver doesn't work the same. Different chemicals aren't being produced the same. We're not filtering fat the same in our body. Things are happening when we're stressed. And when all of this is going on, and we've got the increase in blood pressure and the increase in heart rate, and our blood vessels have constricted, this all isn't good. So let's talk about what ends up happening. By the way, in the short term, all of that is okay. If somebody cuts us off on the freeway and we go, oh my gosh, and we swerve and we beep and our heart's racing and oh my gosh, that was so close, I can't believe that happened. We're stressed. But they pull away, we get into the lane where we're comfortable, we chill out again in 10-15 minutes, we're good. So our body is set up to handle that pretty well. It's not set up to handle that in long term, to have that stress chronically or in the long term, for a long time is what chronic means. So if these changes hang around, there's something called allostatic load that happens. So that's defined as the accumulating adverse, meaning bad, the accumulating adverse effects of stress resulting from the physiological changes that occur with chronic exposure to stress. So we just talked about all the physiological changes. When that all of their effects accumulate over time, the body is experiencing what they call an allostatic load. It's not good for us to have stress chronically. That's why they've actually given this term a name, allostatic load. The load builds up, and these cumulative adverse effects, they have a impact on our body. So let's talk about what happens. Again, we're talking now about chronic stress and this allostatic load that occurs. How do they affect us? Look at the PowerPoint. These are really some of the basic, general, most impacting effects of chronic stress. Suppression of the immune function. So what that means in general, and your book talks, it actually has a nice little picture of this. Our body is really amazing. We can fight illnesses from as small as the cold, the common cold, to the AIDS virus, to cancer cells. And our body, if you take cancer cells as an example, and your book has a nice little picture of this actually, our body often, they feel, has cancer cells in them. And we have natural killer cells, they call them NK cells. They go and they just beat the tar out of the cancer cells. They literally eat them. And then the cancer never becomes an issue. Those mutated cells never take over because they are handled by our immune system. When they take over, when they multiply in mass and our natural killer cells are not strong enough or they don't recognize them as an invader, that becomes a problem. So chronic stress, what they have shown actually, is that it actually suppresses this really amazing immune function of our body to handle all of this, all of the bad things that can go on in our body, all the invaders, like with our natural killer cells as one example. Those don't work as well. So summarized as saying our immune functions are suppressed. Another effect is we have an increased blood pressure and heart rate. Abnormal heart rhythms. again, with the increase in blood pressure, with the heart rate increasing, with the constriction of blood vessels, having abnormal heart rhythms, it's not something we're interested. It's not good for us. We see ventricle arrhythmias, and unfortunately that can be a precursor to sudden death. So again, not positive. The next one, long-term chemical imbalances. That's kind of what I alluded to in the last PowerPoint. We see things like our lipid level changes. When that changes, we see an increase in atherosclerosis, which is hardening of the arteries. We see memory going down. And I think you've probably, when you're really stressed for a long period of time, you feel like I can't retain anything. It happens. We see cognitive changes. Our memory is not as strong, our verbal function's not as strong, and our concentration is decreased. We also see a decrease in sleep. You lay awake at night, you can't fall asleep. You fall asleep, you wake up in the middle of the night, you can't go back to sleep. You want to sleep too much. We just see a change in sleep. And overall, to be honest with you, we see a decrease of good sleep. And we see more fat storage around the gut. The reason that that's in particularly brought up in this part is because storing fat in that particular part of the body linked to more heart disease. So if you look at a lot of this, any one of them, I think our body could handle. All of them together, that becomes a problem. And look at the bottom of the PowerPoint. In addition to all of these physiological changes, the body's ability to effectively cope with stress diminishes over time with exposure to chronic stress. So like I said, we can deal with this on a short-term basis. Somebody cuts us off on the freeway, our body eventually goes back to homeostasis or some level functioning. When we're exposed to chronic stress, our body doesn't even get back to level or an average functioning very well. It doesn't do well because we've got this chronic stress going on in our life. So our body doesn't get back, doesn't even deal with those spikes in stress because we've been exposed to chronic stress. Okay, so researchers got pretty interested in chronic stress, daily stressors, all this stress in our lives, how they are linked to us, our physiological outcome, in essence, our health. Ultimately came down to our health. So what they developed these interesting scales, and the one I'm going to show you is the social readjustment rating scale. So this is where researchers explore the potential effect of daily stressors and hassles that we might encounter. They had subjects look at lists of potential stressors, identify which of them had happened in the last year, and then each of those has a point value. So really what they were doing was kind of giving weight to potential stressors. And some of them are daily stressors, but you can see when those happen, though, the effects of them can be quite long term, and that's why they get a higher number. So in the next two slides, read the stressors and go ahead and take the scale. Add it up. The first one is for college students. They adapted it. They call it the student stress scale. So go ahead and every one of those that's happened to you in the last year, add up that number for it. So if you've lost a close family member in the last year, you get 100. If you've had a new boyfriend or girlfriend, number 16, that actually has a stress scale point value assigned to it. So it's a 38. So go ahead and add everything up for the last year. This is the actual kind of sample items from the real SRRS, the Social Readjustment Rating Scale, just for the general population. So go ahead and add that up. Add up your points for the last year. Go ahead and hit pause and do that. All right, so once you've done that, if you haven't done that, go back and do it because I want you to see kind of where you fall on here. Once you have added up your points, you can see that what they found by doing this and then following these people longitudinally over time is that the higher their score, the stronger the chance was that these people were going to have an illness that was related to the amount of stress in their lives. So look, if you scored a 150 or below, they didn't really see that associated with any illnesses at all. Then you go up a little bit. If people fell between 150 and 199, they found that they had about a 33% increased chance of illness. You don't need to remember these particular percentages or scores here, by the way. I just want you to see how it increases, the percentage increases as the points increase. So 200 to 299, those people have about a 50% increased chance of illness related to stressors. And then if you're at 300 or plus points, they found about an 80% increased chance of illness related to the stressors. So what does that tell us overall about stress of life? Stress is indeed correlated with getting sick. It's not a coincidence that we see a significant spike in illnesses around, for example, finals. People tend to get sick during finals week, but very much so after finals. Your body kind of rises to the occasion, handles all the stress, and then crashes. And we see an increase experience of illnesses. Not a coincidence. Stress is indeed correlated with getting sick. There is a justifiable link between stress, illness, and even death. So with that being said, what do we do about it? Because we're obviously going to be faced with stressful events. So let's talk about some coping strategies and styles in your book. Something really interesting, pessimism and optimism. The way that we explain these events of our world, this does appear to influence how we handle stress. So we've already discussed in a previous chapter, pessimistic explanatory style. We said that was a tendency to make internal, stable, and global explanations for negative events. So that's on your PowerPoint. So you make internal, stable, and global explanations for negative events. These negative events are who I am, they're going to continue to happen, and it's just the way it's going to be in all situations of my life. These are the things that happen. For negative events. For positive events, they tend to say they're external. I got lucky, unstable, not going to temporary, not going to continue, and specific. Just in that event, just in that specific part of my life, this good thing happened. That's a pessimistic explanatory style overall. But there's also an optimistic explanatory style, and you can imagine it's the opposite. It's the optimistic explanatory style is a tendency to make external, unstable, or temporary, and specific explanations for negative events. And then we make internal, stable, and global explanations for positive events. So take a minute and let that sink in about what those two explanatory styles, how they differ. Being optimistic, I put this on the outline because I think you know what it means to be optimistic, but just in case, those people who are optimistic, they usually expect the best in uncertain times. They count on good things to happen to them in the future. Optimistic people, when they have to predict their future, they really often assume more good things than bad. So how do these explanatory styles or being pessimistic or optimistic affect us? What ends up happening is, for example, people with a pessimistic explanatory style, they had worse coping, because we're talking about coping strategies and styles, they coped in a less effective way with stressors in their lives, and they ended up A, reporting more stress, and B, having a more significant impact on their overall health. People who had a pessimistic explanatory style, they were less healthy. And the opposite is true. Optimistic explanatory style people, they coped better with stress, they reported having less stress, and ultimately they were healthier. And by the way, I don't just mean the physiological health of your body. Depression as well, even though that is a physiological cause. I just want you to realize that's also playing into this equation. People with a pessimistic explanatory style also reported more symptoms of chronic or clinical depression than did people who were optimistic. People who were optimistic and tended to look at events optimistically reported less depression. So being optimistic, it's good for us. We report less stress, we're healthier, we have less symptoms of depression. It's good for us. And by the way, the interesting study where they shot the cold virus up. They had a group of people in a room, and they said, you may or may not be exposed to the cold virus. And they shot this little mist up in everybody's nose. But here's the deal. Everybody got the common cold virus, the rhinovirus. Everybody did. But everybody was told you may or may not get it. You don't know. Some people will and some people won't. Everybody did. Before they did this, everybody's explanatory style was assessed, and people were either pessimistic, strong and pessimistic explanatory style, or strong and optimistic. And those are the people they chose. The people right in the middle, they didn't look at them as much in this particular study. They took those very strong and pessimistic explanatory style, those very strong and optimistic explanatory style, put them in a room, shot the cold virus up everybody's nose, but told them, you may or may not have gotten the cold virus. You may have gotten a placebo. Then they looked at cold symptoms, and guess what? By the way, everybody got the real cold virus. People who had a pessimistic explanatory style, they were much more likely to get the symptoms of a cold. And people who had an optimistic explanatory style, less likely to report cold symptoms. But they were all given the same virus. So what happened? Their bodies dealt with it differently. Remember, we talked about how your immune system is influenced. Because pessimistic people are more stressed, their immune systems tend to be less efficient and effective than someone who is optimistic. So someone who is optimistic tends to be overall a healthier person. And in this particular study, they fought the cold virus efficiently and effectively. By the way, when they did get symptoms, they had them significantly fewer days, and they got over them much quicker. So it's a pretty good thing to be optimistic. All right, let's talk about perceived control. This is another issue when we come to coping, when we're talking about coping strategies and styles. The two characteristics of psychological control and self-efficacy, those are the two that we're going to talk about. They found to have a strong relationship to feeling less stress. So psychological control, defined on your outline, the belief that you have some sense of control over a stressor, perceiving that you have control results in more self-efficacy. And we're going to talk about self-efficacy in a minute. But having control, and even if it's just perceived control, means we feel less stress in that situation. And the opposite's true. Less control, more stress. So now, okay, so talk about what that means in your daily life. If you perceive to have control of something going on, even if you might not really have control, but say you have an illness and you start doing research about that illness, and you start making a list of things you need to do, specialists you would like to contact, websites you want to visit, lifestyle changes you want to make, you feel less stressed by the fact that you have that illness than someone who doesn't feel like they have any control over this situation. In your daily life, it could be something as simple as I'm someone who, if the kitchen sink is cleaned out, if the kitchen counter and the kitchen sink is cleaned out, I feel less stress. That's my little micro way of managing control in my life. Does that really mean that my house is more manageable? No, it really doesn't. But that's my sense of control. That's how I feel more in control of the craziness going on in my world, is if my kitchen sink and my kitchen counters, if they're cleaned off, man, I feel less stress. So in our daily lives, however you can manage stress, if you're a lister, if you make a list every day, if you're someone who uses your phone to keep reminding you of where you got to be, what you got to do, if you have a day timer, if you like to organize, that's found to lead us to feel less stress. Now, what that means also is when we feel less stress and we have more control or perceived control in our worlds, we have a better immune response. What's that mean? That means we're healthier overall. That means when they shoot the cold virus up our nose, we're less likely to get sick, or if we get sick, we get over it quicker. So again, psychological control. We feel less stress, and we feel physiologically we're better. Our immune system is better, and we have less overall health effects. So it's good for us. We also said it results in more self-efficacy, so look on your PowerPoint for what that means. Self-efficacy, the belief that your specific behaviors will bring about desired outcomes. This is different than self-esteem, which is kind of this global outlook on yourself. This is something about specific behaviors that we do. We believe that specific behaviors will bring about certain desired outcomes. I believe that if I study this particular course a little bit every day, I'm going to do better. And my belief that those specific behaviors will bring about the desired outcome of doing better on a test, that's my self-efficacy in regard to studying that particular topic. If I feel that if I make an effort to get up and go for a walk every day, those specific behaviors will bring about my desired outcome of being healthier. So my self-efficacy regarding my own physical health is increased. So that's what self-efficacy is. By the way, here's what they found. People with higher self-efficacy, they have less stress. And by the way, if you have more control, you have higher self-efficacy. So that results in less stress. Having a higher self-efficacy and having less stress result again in having better immune response to illnesses. We're overall healthier, and when we do get sick, we get well quicker. So it's good for us. And by the way, personality psychologists don't necessarily believe that you're born into this world to be an optimist or a pessimist or feel like you have psychological control or feel that you have self-efficacy. These are parts of our personality that we can definitely influence over time. So you've heard people say, after that particular life event, I'm definitely more optimistic. I definitely focus on the glass being half full. When I saw so-and-so struggle and succeed, or maybe struggle and not succeed, I'm going to change the way I handle the events in my life. And I'm going to try and have more control. And then we start looking at that event differently, like we have more self-efficacy in certain situations. And ultimately, we're more optimistic. And it's good for us. So those are things we have control over. Optimism, control, and self-efficacy. All right, now let's look at particular coping strategies, positive emotions and coping with stress. These are really interesting. Your book does a great job. Look at your chapter outline for the particular page numbers. I'm not going to lecture over this because I would just be rereading your book to you. So I want you to go ahead and take a look at your text. Fair game for quizzes and tests. Get comfortable with the overall message of this section, the role of positive emotions in coping with stress. But also look at the terms below. You need to know, in general, what are they talking about when they're talking about positive emotion coping strategies? And then the particular 3 strategies they go over. Know what they mean and be able to give an example, conjure one up in your head of positive reappraisal, problem-focused coping, and creating positive events. And then you'll be all set, because that's the chapter.